The morning she showed up on Walt Casper's porch, she had mud on her left boot only, which was a kind of detail that stays with you when everything else about memory goes soft. Just the one boot. The right one was clean, like she'd stepped careful over something the rest of the world didn't have to think about. Walt was on the porch with his coffee going cold the way it always did, because he'd pour it and then remember something needed doing, and then the coffee would just sit there, patient as an old dog. He saw her coming up the lane from the road before she saw him. She was carrying a carpet bag that had seen better decades and a hat box with no hat in it. He found that out later, that it was just filled with letters she didn't want crumpled, and she was walking the way people walk when they've made a decision and they're terrified of it at the same time. Not slow, not fast, just the kind of walk that's holding itself very still on the inside. This was 1887, the town of Harlan's Creek, which wasn't much of a creek and barely enough to be called a town, sat in the middle of Kansas with all the ambition of a man who'd given up on ambition. One general store, a livery that smelled worse than liveries are supposed to, a church that held services twice a month, when Reverend Pratt could be bothered to come down from Salina, and people who had known each other long enough that they'd stopped being curious about one another and started just keeping score. Her name was Clara Holt. She had been Clara Briggs before she married Ned Holt, and she'd been Clara Briggs for 22 years before that, and none of those years had prepared her for the 8 months she spent being Clara Holt, and none of those 8 months had prepared her for Ned deciding, somewhere around the 4th month, that he'd rather be in Dodge City with a woman named Loretta who ran a hat shop and laughed at things that weren't funny. But that isn't exactly right either, because Ned didn't just leave. Ned left and told people things first. Told Thomas Abel at the general store. Told the Hennessy brothers at the livery. Told Reverend Pratt, which was the cruelest thing, because Pratt had a mouth that opened as easy as a gate with a broken latch. Ned told him that Clara had not been a faithful wife, which was a lie so complete and so constructed that it had load-bearing walls. And by the time Clara understood what was happening, the lie was already part of the architecture of Harlan's Creek. She'd tried to stay. She'd tried for 4 months. For months of walking into Abel's store and watching Thomas find something to do on the other side of the room. For months of women at the church steps going quiet in a way that was louder than anything they could have said. For months of her own landlady, a widow named Mrs. Pruitt, sliding the rent envelope back under Clara's door with a note that said simply, "I think it best." For months of that is a long time. Some people can hold up under it. Clara was not weak. Understand that before you picture her any other way. Clara was not weak, but she was human, and human has its limits, and 4 months in Harlan's Creek had found hers. She'd tried one other town. Spent 6 weeks in a place called Millbrook, but Ned had a cousin in Millbrook, and word travels faster than wagons. So she came out the other end of that, and she came to Walt Casper's lane at 8 in the morning with one muddy boot, because Walt Casper's place was the only name her friend Dottie had given her before Clara left. Pressed into her hand on a folded piece of paper. Walt Casper. Runs cattle out near the cedar breaks. He's decent. That was the whole of it. Dottie had said the word decent like it was something she didn't take for granted, which it wasn't, which Clara understood now better than she ever had before. Walt Casper was 61 years old and had been alone on that land for 11 years, since his wife Ruth passed from a fever that came on a Tuesday and was done with her by the following Monday. He had a ranch hand named Pico who showed up 3 days a week and never explained where he was the other 4, and a dog named Senator who was mostly deaf and entirely devoted, and about 400 head of cattle that gave him something to do with himself, which was, he had come to understand, the real value of cattle. He was not a talker. He was not a man who needed things explained to him in ways that implied he'd understand better if you used smaller words. He had a face that had been outdoors for 6 decades and looked it, and hands that were not delicate. And he read the Bible some nights, and some nights he read dime novels, and he didn't see why a man had to pick one or the other. He stood up when she came to the porch steps. She stopped at the bottom of them. Senator came around from the side of the house and sat down next to her feet and looked up at her, which he did with everyone, because everyone was equally interesting to Senator now that he couldn't hear any of them. "Mr. Casper," she said. "That's right. My name is Clara Holt. Dottie Marsh sent me," she said, and here she stopped, and he could see her deciding something, reorganizing something. She said, "You might have work." Walt looked at her for a moment. Not the way some men look at a woman, sizing up what she is or isn't. Just the way you look at a person when you're trying to understand what kind of trouble they're carrying and how long they've been carrying it. I might, he said. You want coffee first? It wasn't exactly a question. She came up the steps and he poured her a cup and they sat on the porch and the coffee was cold and neither of them mentioned it. She didn't tell him everything that morning. She told him some of it, the outline of it, Ned and the leaving and the lies and the town, and she told in the flat. Careful voice people use when they've told a hard thing so many times it's worn smooth, when they've taken all the raw feeling out of it, because raw feeling makes other people uncomfortable, and she'd learned lately to manage other people's discomfort at her own expense. Walt listened without filling the silence with comfort, which was the right thing to do and rarer than it should be. When she was done, he was quiet for a spell. Senator had fallen asleep against her right foot. I need somebody who can cook and keep the house, Walt said. Pico takes care of the outside. I'm not looking for anything beyond that, and I'll say so plainly so there's no confusion on either end. There won't be, she said. Pays not much. There's a room off the kitchen that's private. You'd eat with me unless you didn't want to. That's fair. All right then, he said. That was the whole negotiation. People did things differently then, and also Walt Casper was not a man who believed in using 20 words where 4 would do. The first week was cautious on both sides. She learned the kitchen, which was a serious kitchen, meaning Ruth Casper had known what she was doing and had set up, so the work flowed naturally from left to right, and everything had a home and the home made sense. Clara cooked well and knew it, and the first night she made a beef stew with the dried herbs she found in Ruth's little tin boxes above the stove, and Walt came in and sat down and ate it without a word of complaint, which he was beginning to understand was as close as he came to praise. She found, in the second week, that the work steadied her, not in a way that fixed anything. The damage Ned had done was not the kind that gets fixed by keeping busy, and she wasn't silly enough to think otherwise. But the way a splint steadies a broken thing while it heals however it's going to heal, she had something to do with her hands. She had a rhythm. She had a room with a door she could close. The town of Harlan's Creek was 9 miles away, and Clara did not go to it. Walt went twice a month, usually for supplies. He asked her once if she needed anything from town, and she gave him a short list written on the back of an envelope, and didn't offer an explanation for why she wasn't coming herself. And he didn't ask for one. He did, however, come home from that particular trip to town wearing an expression she couldn't read. And he put the supplies on the table and put the change in a jar on the shelf and stood there a moment with his back to her before he said, Thomas Abel sends his regards. Clara was quiet. I told him I didn't know why he thought I'd be interested in that. Walt said he still had his back to her. His hand was resting on the shelf next to the jar, not gripping it. Just resting, the way a man's hand rests on something when he's keeping the rest of himself very still. Thank you, she said. I'm going to see about the fence on the south pasture, he said, and he went outside. That was October. By November, she had learned the shape of his silences, which were many and various. There was the silence of a man thinking. There was the silence of a man who had decided something and hadn't yet figured out how to say it. There was a silence he went into after supper some evenings, where he'd sit with the Bible open on his knee, but he wasn't reading it, just holding it, like the weight of the book was useful even when the words weren't. One evening she came to the sitting room after he'd gone to bed, and she saw he'd left something on the table, a pocket watch, old, the kind of old that's specific, meaning this watch had been old when someone gave it to him. It was open, face up, but the face was cracked across the bottom third, so that the numbers from 7 to 10 were behind a white web of broken glass. The hand still moved. She knew because she stood there longer than she should have and watched the second hand going around. And it went around fine, and the watch kept time. But the crack was there, had been there a while by the look of it, and he'd never had it fixed. She didn't touch it. She went to bed. She asked Pico about it, sideways, the next time he was out. Pico was a small man of indeterminate years who wore the same hat regardless of weather and spoke English when it suited him and Spanish when that suited him better. The watch, she said. The cracked one. Pico thought about this. His boys, he said. His son. She waited. Boy died. Pico said what she had not known. 8, 9 years ago. Horse. She didn't ask any more. Pico went back to the fence he was repairing. Senator came and sat next to Pico and watched him work with the alert, useless attention of profoundly deaf. Clara thought about a man who carries a broken thing because he can't set it down and won't have it mended. She thought she understood that more than she could have said out loud. You know, I'm not sure I ever told anyone this next part, and I don't know if it matters, but I'm going to tell it because I think it's the part that's actually true. It wasn't any grand moment that changed things for Clara Holt. It wasn't a confrontation. It wasn't a scene where the truth came out and people apologized and the record got set straight. Life does not, as a general rule, work that way, and the people who tell you otherwise are selling something. What happened was smaller than that, and, in some ways, harder. In December, a woman came out to ranch. She came in a buggy with her husband, a man named Carter Finch, who ran cattle his own about 15 miles east. Clara was in the kitchen when she heard them, and she stayed in the kitchen, and Walt went to the door. She could hear from the kitchen, not words, just tones, the particular tone of a woman being friendly in a way that's doing double duty, being friendly and also asking something. She heard Walt's voice shorter, answering, then the woman's voice again, then quiet. Walt came into the kitchen. "Eliza Finch," he said. "She's asking after you." Clara looked at him. "She knows a woman over in Millbrook," he said, apparently. And there it was. However it had traveled. It had traveled. "I can go," Clara said, "if it's a problem." Walt Casper looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was not pity and was not anger and was something else she didn't have a word for yet. Something that lived between those two things and was quieter than either. "I'll tell her you're busy," he said, and he went back to the door. She stood at the kitchen window and couldn't see the buggy from that angle, just the edge of the lane and the cedar trees beyond, moving a little in the cold wind. She heard the conversation end. She heard the buggy turn and go. Walt came back in. He poured himself coffee. He stood at the counter with it. "Walt," she said, "I'm not what they say I am." He looked at her over the cup. "I know that," he said, like it was a fact that had been established some time ago, and he wasn't sure why it needed saying again. She turned back to the window. Something in her chest, which had been pulled tight as a fence wire for almost a year, went a little slack. Not loose, not relaxed, just a degree or two less taut, which was enough for that day. Winter came down hard on that part of Kansas that year, the way it does when it means it, and there was a week in January where nobody went anywhere. Pico didn't come out. The cattle were in the near pasture, and Walt checked them morning and evening, and came back in stamping snow off his boots and warming his hands over the stove, and Clara was soup ready, because that was the kind of thing that didn't need to be asked for. They talked more those days, because the cold pushes people together in small spaces, and after a while silence becomes something you're doing on purpose, and that gets awkward. They talked about small things. The weather, obviously. The cattle. Whether the roof over the kitchen lean-to was going to need attention in the spring, which it was. He told her about Ruth. Not all at once, and not in any order. Just small pieces, as they became relevant to whatever they were already talking about. She told him about her years in Cheyenne when she was young, before she'd come back to Kansas, which were the best years she'd had up to then, and maybe still. She'd worked at a millinery there, fitting hats, and she'd been good at it, good at looking at a face and knowing what shape a brim would do it justice. "I like hats," she said. "I noticed the hat box," he said. "I never explained that." "You don't have to explain things to me." "It's letters," she said, "in the box. Letters I wrote to Ned after he left. Before I understood that writing them was just..." She stopped, and her hands did something, smoothed something on the table that didn't need smoothing. It wasn't helping. "Did you send any of them?" "No. That's probably wise," he said. "I know it's wise," she said. "Knowing something's wise doesn't always help in the middle of the night." He nodded. He understood that. He understood it specifically. The snow melted and Pico came back and the world opened up again, and there was work to do, always work to do, which was a covenant of ranch life. You did not run out of things that needed doing. The land was consistent in its demands. In March, Reverend Pratt came through. He came out to the Casper place for the same reason he always had, which was that Walt gave a reasonable donation to the church, and Pratt liked to maintain those relationships in person. He was not a bad man, Pratt. He was a man who believed what people told him and repeated it without thinking about whether he should, which is a failing, but it's a human one and pretty common. He came in and Clara made coffee. Real coffee this time, hot, and she set out the good cups, which were Ruth's cups, and she'd asked Walt before about using them, and he'd said, of course. What cups for? Pratt didn't know her at first. She'd changed her hair since Harlan's Creek, had it pinned differently, and she was in working clothes, not Sunday clothes. And a person looks different when they're on home ground. Then he knew her. She could see the moment. His eyes went careful. She poured his coffee and put it in front of him and didn't make it easy on him or hard on him. Just put the coffee down and said, "It's good to see you, Reverend," which was more than he deserved and less than a lie. It was just the words you said. He looked at the cup. He looked at Walt. He looked like a man performing a rapid internal calculation. "Mrs. Holt," he said. Eventually, "It's warm for March," Walt said, which is a way of changing the subject so smoothly that there was nothing to argue with. Pratt took his coffee, and they talked about the church roof, which also needed work, and the spring planting in town. And eventually Pratt left. He shook Walt's hand on the porch. He tipped his hat to Clara, which she hadn't expected, and then he was gone down the lane. Walt watched the buggy go. "He'll talk," Clara said. "Maybe," Walt said. "Probably." He looked at the lane a moment longer. "I've been in this county for 30 years, he said, which was not exactly an explanation, but it was something. It was a fact about how long he'd been here and what that was worth. She thought about Dottie's note. He's decent. Dottie had known something Clara hadn't known how to look for. Spring came on, and with it a morning in April that Clara would remember more clearly than most. She was in the garden. She'd planted one, a small one, with Walt's permission and Pico's grudging assistance in breaking ground, and she was on her knees in the dirt pulling early weeds, and Senator was asleep 3 feet away in a patch of sun, and she had her hands in the earth, and for a moment, just a moment, she was simply doing what she was doing, and her mind was nowhere else. It lasted maybe 20 seconds, but 20 seconds of that is not nothing. 20 seconds of your mind being only where your hands are, not in Harlan's Creek, not in the months after Ned, not calculating the future or sorting through the past. 20 seconds of just the dirt and the sun and the old deaf dog. That is a thing. That is actually a thing. She sat back on her heels and she looked at the garden row and the weed pile and the sleeping dog and she thought, there's that. Not a lot, but there's that. By summer. Carter Finch came out to look at one of Walt's bulls he was thinking of buying, and Eliza Finch came with him. She was a tall woman, red-haired, with a decisive manner of someone who'd been a practical one in every room she'd ever been in. She came in, and Clara was making lunch, and there was a moment in the kitchen where there were just 2 women in the kitchen, which meant the moment was either going to be awkward or it wasn't. Eliza picked up a knife and started cutting the bread without being asked. Clara let her. I knew Ned Holt's family some, Eliza said. She didn't say it like an accusation. She said the way you put something on a table, so it's visible. People did, Clara said. His father was a liar too, Eliza said. Ran up debts across 3 counties and moved his family before anybody knew what was owed. She said it plainly, without drama, as she cut the bread. The Holts come by it naturally. Clara didn't say anything. You make good bread. Eliza said, thank you. And that was that. The men came in for lunch, and they talked about the bull, and after lunch the Finches drove home, and Eliza raised her hand as the buggy turned. Not exactly a wave, more a signal. Just a hand going up. Clara raised hers back. Later that evening, Walt was in the sitting room, and Clara came through to get something from the shelf, and she noticed the pocket watch wasn't on the table where it usually sat. She didn't ask. But the next morning, when she was dusting in there, she saw it had been moved to the small shelf above the fireplace. Not put away, not hidden, just moved. Set up where the light came through the window in the late afternoon. She dusted around it and left it where it was. I've been trying to tell this story the way it actually was, not the way it would be more satisfying if it were. And the way it actually was, there wasn't a day where everything turned. There wasn't a moment where Harlan's Creek admitted what it had done, and Clara walked back in with her head high and a little music behind her. That's not how a town works, and it's not how people work. What there was a slow accretion of small things, the way a riverbank builds up, not from one big deposit, but from 1,000 little ones. And over enough time you look, and there's solid ground where there was just water before. She went into Harlan's Creek for the first time in October, a full year after she'd come to Walt's place. He needed her to pick something up at Abel's store, because he had the Finch Bull situation still tangled up and couldn't leave the property that day. He said it without apology or excessive explanation. Just asked her if she'd mind going, and she said she wouldn't mind, and she went. Thomas, Abel looked up when she came in. She said she was there for the Casper order. He said it was ready. He got it from the back. He put it on the counter. She counted out the money Walt had sent. Exact change, which she always made sure of. Mrs. Holt, Abel said when she was picking up the box. She looked at him. He had the expression of a man who wants to say something that would cost him something to say. He was fighting with it visibly, and she watched the fight happen, and she didn't help him with it. Not one bit. Walt Casper's a good man, Abel said, finally, which was not exactly the thing. But it was adjacent to thing, and Clara Holt had learned, by that October, how to accept adjacent. He is, she said. Good afternoon, Mr. Abel. She walked out of there with the box and put in the wagon and drove back the 9 miles to the ranch. Walt was coming in from the south pasture when she pulled up, and Senator came trotting over in his particular deaf dog way, all purpose and no awareness of what was around him, which meant he walked into things sometimes but never seemed bothered by it. Any trouble? Walt said. No, she said. He nodded and took the box from her and went inside. She unhitched the horse and put him up, which was something she'd gotten competent at over the year, better than she'd been when she arrived, and didn't know the forward from the back of the harness. Pico had taught her, without any patience but without cruelty either. She came in and Walt had put the kettle on. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Walt, I'm glad I came here, she said. He looked at her from the stove. He looked like a man who doesn't know what to do with a thing that's been given to him plainly, which is a very specific kind of expression that some people never learn to read, and she'd gotten good at reading. Good, he said. He turned back to the kettle. Out in the yard, Senator had found a patch of sunlight near the porch steps and put himself in it. He was old enough that sun was pretty much his whole strategy for getting through the day, and it wasn't a bad strategy when you thought about it. The patch of light moved across the yard as the afternoon went on, and Senator moved with it, a few inches at a time. In that way dogs do when they seem asleep, but they've been tracking something all along. The wind came up out of the north and bent the cedar trees along the fence line. Inside, the kettle started.